The Memoirs of Manuel Noriega, written by the Panamanian general Manuel Antonio Noriega Moreno in 1997. Chapter 1. The Gringos Spoil the Party. Looking back, I remember the sight of the bright faces, the cheers, the dark-skinned girls laughing in the sun, the babies held aloft by their mothers. A spontaneous street party as I marched along the main avenue from the Abel Bravo School to military headquarters in Cologne that afternoon, December 19, 1989, the eve of the U.S. invasion of Panama. There was a student celebration at the school. Speeches, applause, inaugurations, ribbon cutting. I usually thrived on such events, enjoying the cheers buoyed by the crowds, but this day I went through it mechanically, distant. When the time came for me to go to the military barracks, I was uncomfortable. I felt distracted. Something was telling me, get out of here, get out of here, get out. I tried to push things along, but protocol takes time. After the students had their ceremonies, I can't even remember exactly what the event was. The major in charge of the military zone insisted that we visited the Cologne military headquarters. Cologne is a small, cheerful city. People of all ages gathered as they saw us coming. They were hanging over balconies, lining the street. There was music and there were kids running alongside us. Panama es una fiesta. Panama is a party. And this day was no exception. We are never so intense and serious, never so engaged in business, never so committed that we cannot stage a spontaneous celebration, no matter what the occasion. It's something North Americans will never understand. Panama is always ready for a party, but never more than during holiday time. And yet for me, this day, it was muted, distant. I was somewhere else, seeing it from a dream. When I arrived for the ceremony on the street in front of the military barracks, everything was in slow motion. How can this be taking so long? I asked myself. I felt feverish, sweaty. My clothes weighed down on me in the late afternoon heat. It got worse and worse. After the street scene, the officers and others insisted that the entourage move inside. I think the military wives were inaugurating a new cultural salon or something. And then, since no one had eaten, there was a late lunch. I had gone to Cologne up the far end of the Panama Canal the day before, on December 18th, to try to mediate a dock workers' dispute. They wanted more money and were ready to strike. It was a tough session, but we pacified them and reached an agreement. I always enjoyed going up to Cologne. I had spent my young days as a junior officer there, under my patron, the late General Omar Torrijos. Returning always lifted my spirits, but this time I had a dull sixth sense that something was wrong. At about 5 p.m., my aides began receiving reports about unusual activity by the Americans in the skies around the Panama Canal. For a while, nothing was said directly to me. Eventually, they told me that planes were landing, that the Americans were bringing in troops. But what did it amount to, really? For more than 20 years, this kind of thing happened periodically. Maneuvers, troop movements, bombers arriving at Howard Air Base. It never followed a pattern. It was normal operating procedure. Nor did the Americans advise us, as they were supposed to do under the Panama Canal Treaties, signed by Jimmy Carter and Torrijos in 1977. During dinner, I was itchy to leave, but more obstacles appeared. A group of businessmen from the Cologne Free Zone approached me with some projects they wanted to propose. I thought I would jump out of my skin, but I put up with it. Finally, one of my officers brought information about the American troop movements. Maneuvers, apparently, he said. We have reports that transport planes with soldiers leaving Fort Bragg are on their way. But no one made anything of it, particularly, and we let protocol take its course. The only concession I made to the maneuvers was in deciding how to return to Panama City. Normally, I might have taken a helicopter back to the capital. With the reports about all the air traffic, I told my bodyguards and the rest of our entourage of military and government officials to prepare for us to drive back to Panama City instead, about an hour's ride. I traveled with my usual convoy of 3 or 4 vehicles. I saw nothing unusual as we skirted the highway that courses along the canal the 50 miles to Panama City. We got home sometime between 6 and 7 p.m. There was still no tangible news about trouble. The atmosphere in Panama City was filled with Christmas cheer. We had no idea what was to come. As the United States prepared to invade my country, Panama was bathed in the normal excitement that precedes Christmas and the New Year. If the insanity of George Herbert Walker Bush's invasion of Panama had not been so cruel and deadly, the situation would have been laughable. Because while Panama prepared for Christmas that evening of December 19th, his frogmen were landing near Rio Hato Beach, looking for where to station themselves to blow up highways and people. His soldiers were practicing land assaults. His communications specialists were preparing to control all the airways and radar channels. And one of the greatest examples of overkill in military history, specially trained U.S. pilots were practicing with their super-secret billion-dollar stealth bombers for a brave attack on a tiny airbase named Rio Hato that housed junior high school students and had few defenders, no planes or radar of its own. While his paratroopers were practicing combat jumps at 700 feet that would break the legs of scores of them and leave them maimed for a lifetime, and his generals were tensely preparing for a massive invasion, the 14th U.S. military intervention in Panama since it was declared independent by the United States, while all this was going on, Panama was getting ready to celebrate. The Christmas spirit was in the air. People were smiling, gathering in bars for a special drink with friends, running around buying presents. The wives of officers were gathering up gifts and toys for the needy, and trees were being decorated. True, I was feeling the tension. There had been a shooting involving American military personnel who had run a roadblock outside our headquarters in Chorrillo. And the Americans also said that a husband and wife had been accosted the previous Saturday night, December 16th. Sexual assault, they said. Bush, that noble defender of humankind, had gone on television almost teary-eyed, saying that no American president would permit his country's women to be jostled by a bunch of thugs. It was as if I personally had gone down to headquarters and grabbed this woman. Actually, we couldn't find the woman, and the whole idea that American military personnel who were restricted to base and were not allowed out to go to a movie or a restaurant could have gotten so lost as to drive right up to a Panamanian military command headquarters raised more questions than it answered. This was Christmas time, and we went about our normal business. My troops had been reduced for the holidays. Our bases had skeleton staffs. Officers were at home with their families. This was not an army manning barricades. We were a professional force with thousands of troops, but we could scarcely even conceive of defending ourselves against an overwhelming blitzkrieg. We had never bothered preparing for an American invasion. The idea then and now would be idiotic. First of all, invasion of Panama would be a violation of international laws that protected our sovereignty. How does one plan for an invasion from the United States? After all, they were already there, a permanent invasion force. The Americans surrounded us all the time. Until 1999, they were to be permanently ensconced on our territory in 14 bases that were home to more than 20,000 soldiers from all branches of the U.S. military. We had no combat planes, and they controlled our airspace whenever they wanted to. They probably would have had little trouble in killing me or capturing me whenever they felt like it. I knew all this. But I thought, naively, that the United States ultimately would honor its neutrality treaty with us and the principles of international law and adhere to the concept of non-aggression against any country. It is an umbrella under which civilized countries operate, so that this right is foremost founded upon the 1945 UN Charter of the Great Nations of the world. We did, in fact, have contingency plans for dealing with emergencies, though not invasions. In a real sense, an invasion of Panama by the United States was a redundancy, so we couldn't exactly react in classic military terms. Instead, our strategy was to oppose any extension of the present American occupation. First, troops were to establish a safe perimeter around the Panamanian military command headquarters. My command would be at the rear guard of my home territory of Chiriquí province, from where our units could mount a military reaction force, a control center for the military command structure from which to base fighting and resistance. Next, Panama Defense Forces troops were to be deployed with roadblocks all around the capital. We would then start organizing a civilian protest march into the city. We were ready for hand-to-hand local combat in such a situation. If the United States had tried that, it would have been bloody for them and they wouldn't have won. We had superiority because the civilian population had been organized into civil defense units called the Dignity Battalions. These neighborhood forces were prepared to fight with the fervor of those who battle for the survival of their nation, their homes, and their lives. Not all of them were under arms, but we had thousands of rifles, machine guns, and rocket launchers at various secret munition stockpiles. Upon the decision to launch our plan, our G3 forces were to start distributing the weaponry so our civil defense could defend against any invaders on the ground. The goal of our planning was to be prepared with measured responses toward establishing control and confrontation, but not to go beyond confronting whatever provocation developed. We never had any plan to take hostages or to launch a treacherous attack against an American target. We did have staggering areas for troop deployment and high points overlooking Fort Clayton, where the U.S. Army was based. The U.S. ambassador's residence was a target for a retaliatory attack, if it became necessary. So were fuel storage dumps held by the Americans. These were key elements in establishing a defensive perimeter if the Americans left their bases and tried to take over. But what we could not plan for was an aerial bombardment, which is exactly what happened. The bombing amounted to destruction of the armed forces, an attack on the civilian population, and the rupture of our principal lines of communication. We were not prepared for such an assault, nor were we prepared when that aggression hit innocent people. By severing our communications, I could not issue orders via the chain of command. By cutting out our corridors, our ability to shuttle men and equipment was destroyed. So was my plan for retreat. When it became clear that we needed to put our plans in action, it was already too late. Air routes were blocked. I couldn't get through. In retrospect, I should have realized what was happening. There were several reasons why I didn't. First, American maneuvers were no surprise. Whenever they staged an operation, the Americans exaggerated. Too many men, too many aircraft, too much ammunition. Second, I was getting skewed information from a member of my own staff, whose name I will not identify. As I tell the story of the invasion and my imprisonment, I at times realized that I must shield the identities of some people who served with me in the National Guard and later in the Panamanian Defense Forces. Many of my colleagues still fear reprisals against themselves and their families for the simple act of defending their country against the United States. Others who may have made mistakes and behaved dishonorably at the time feel remorse for their wartime actions, but still fear reprisals. I reject acts of revenge against any Panamanian for his or her part in events leading up to and surrounding the U.S. invasion of Panama. Nor will I engage in a war of words with my Panamanian opponents over the years. Whether they realized it or not, our common enemies were the Reagan and Bush administrations, whose policies duped and overpowered us. My attention is directed toward highlighting those infamous acts. After returning from Cologne, I went to one of the alternate offices I had around the city, a PDF, Panamanian Defense Forces facility, in the Torrijos Memorial House on Calle 50 in downtown Panama City, one of the palaces dedicated to the memory of Torrijos, who died in a plane crash in 1981. A group of friends and military people joined me there, but the focus of attention was not on an invasion. Occasionally, more information on troop movements came in as we monitored American radio and television. There were several possibilities that they were moving against Cuba, that these were maneuvers in a show of force against us with a little harassment thrown in, that perhaps the movements had nothing to do with Panama. The previous weekend, I recalled, the United States had mobilized an attack on Colombia. At least one injured man had been airlifted back to Gorgas Hospital, a U.S. military facility in the former Canal Zone. It was possible that the Americans were preparing for further action against narcotics trafficking targets in Colombia or Cuba. All the while, there was the possibility of a commando attack by the Americans or another Panamanian coup attempt against me. So, as a precaution against someone staging a raid, I decided to be a moving target. I ordered up a small convoy, composed of my bodyguard escort and the Special Forces team. There were 14 brave men with me: Andres Rodriguez, Ivan Castillo, Omar Pinto, Simon Bolivar Herrera, Viviano Arboleda, Carlos Corcha, Nicolas Palacios, Santiago Padilla, Alcibiades Melgar, Marcelo Truckman, Antonio Singh, Marcos Saldana, and Jorge Juan Rodriguez. In addition, one man, identified only as JF for his own protection in Panama, was assigned as chief bodyguard for my family. He entered the Cuban embassy with the family and served as a contact for messages. We used 3 vehicles, a Ford or Hyundai, a Toyota Land Cruiser, and a Mercedes sedan. I often brought along the Mercedes as a decoy vehicle. I rode in the Hyundai. Heading out toward the international airport outside town, I planned to stop for a while at the Hotel Cerami, located close to the entrance to the airport terminal. The hotel had become a military facility in recent years. From there, I had a special hidden telephone line from which I would contact our man inside the U.S. Embassy to find out what was going on. By the time we were underway, it was approaching midnight. As we left the environs of the city along the highway that leads out of town, we saw the city streets almost empty. Few civilians were out and there was little traffic, other than some Panamanian military vehicles speeding about. What we could not see yet was more significant than anything else. The skies above us were controlled by the Americans, who were poised to strike on many fronts, by land, sea, and air. Even if I had heeded the warnings and managed to get on the airplane earlier in the day, I still would have been a sitting duck because the U.S. military started to take over our airspace at perhaps 4 or 5 in the afternoon. So if I had tried to get out toward the Atlantic, I would have been a fixed target. Once in the air, trying to fly toward the Pacific to Chiriquí would have been just as bad, since either way they could monitor the sky from the same stretch of territory with their string of radar installations. The noose had already been set. We made it to the Cerami without problems. We hadn't been there long when I made contact with our U.S. Embassy plant. His message was concise and to the point. Evasion and escape. Authorized to kill MAN. We began hearing bombs reverberating closer and closer to us. In similar circumstances, Charles de Gaulle had been forced to flee the invading Nazi army a half-century earlier. De Gaulle and his men made a battlefield decision to look for an innocent-looking civilian plane, managing to flee across the English Channel from Bordeaux to Heston, south of London. I did not have de Gaulle's good fortune. I had thought that a plane without Air Force markings might leave the international airport unnoticed and get to Chiriquí. I knew the odds made it almost impossible, but there were few other options. I put on civilian clothes and jumped into the Hyundai with 2 bodyguards. The rest of the escorts followed behind in the Land Cruiser. All of them showed great determination and poise, all prepared to fight for their lives and to protect their commander-in-chief and comrades in arms. As we pulled away from the Cerami, we had our first clear view of what was happening. There, lit against tracers in the dim light, I could see hundreds of parachutes, an insane image of a Hollywood movie, come to life. American paratroopers landing in Panama, ready to kill the enemy, largely defenseless Panamanians. My mind raced as I took it all in. I had the clear sense that this was a personal battle, that all these machinations were directed by one man against another. George Bush had unleashed the power of the world's greatest military force with one overriding target: me. It was like a nightmare, like falling into a swimming pool, and when you try to reach for the safety of a wall or touch bottom, you suddenly realize that the walls and bottom have fallen away. I couldn't grasp anything or stop my free fall. All I could see was an endless, limitless ocean and thousands of weapons and men hoping to find me in their sights. I thought of a conversation I had had some years earlier with Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, describing for me the U.S. bombing attack against his country. I was remembering his face and his eyes as he said this to me. They attacked my family in the tent where they slept. They killed my little baby boy. They wanted to kill me. I was jogged from these thoughts by an explosion to one side of our little convoy of private cars. What was an abstraction in the distance was now on top of us. War with the Americans. "The paratroopers are still landing," shouted one of the men. We backtracked along the old Tocumen highway. On the radio, I heard a voice that sounded like Captain Heraclide Sucre. His voice was firm, speaking quickly, full of the adrenaline of desperation. "We are on the apron near the start of the runway. Position Nilo Tango," he said. "Heavy fire! Get the commander out of there!" The airport was plainly overrun with paratroopers, some of whom must have noticed us meandering down the road. We started taking fire, which kicked up dirt in the brush along the side of the road as we advanced. The driver reacted well, swerving and then dodging in an irregular pattern to avoid the barrage. But in so doing, he caught a ditch on the side of the road and almost flipped us over. I remember getting my bearings as the men and I scrambled out. I could see helicopters all around and tracers lighting up the sky behind the Serami, parallel to the end of the runway, along with explosions and parachutes in the distance against the black night. Everyone grabbed the weapon closest to him, looking for attackers, dodging incoming fire, and taking shots in the direction of the attackers. The men fought bravely in a pitched battle against the American paratroopers. We were in an advantageous position, lower than the road surface. Close by, we could hear men barking and responding to orders. None of them were Panamanians. I picked up an AK-47 and started fighting. Perhaps my American captors, who have no depths to their cynicism, will try to charge me, seated and railroaded in jail with a war crime for having the gall to defend my own country. But that's what I did. I fired at anything that moved. We were firing into tall grass that separated the road from the runway, aiming machine gun bursts there where the incoming fire was originating. And it is even possible that firing back at the ambushers, I could have killed or wounded one of the brave young men sent by President Bush to capture me that day. More than 2 years later, I found out about the American sergeant, Carlos Morleda, who led those men. I happened to be watching television in jail when I saw a story about him on a Spanish language station. He was left paralyzed in the fighting. He and his platoon just happened to be jumping where we were driving. He described a group of cars coming up the road, an ambush, and a fierce firefight. I don't believe he knows to this day that I was in the group he fought with. What a prize I would have been. He remembers it as a bloody skirmish and a turning point in his life. But he didn't see the far greater opportunity, the prize that eluded him in the distance. A Panamanian soldier taken from his command with only his hands and his head and his heart fighting against him. I think the Americans and the Panamanians both were surprised by the intensity of the battle. Both sides lost men in that brief encounter. The American sergeant said they started out with 11 men and lost 7. We had about the same number. I have no idea how long we were pinned down there. It seemed like an eternity, but in the rush of time and space, it could have been only minutes. Finally, men from the Pumas de Tocumen, commanded by Captain Sucre, came to our aid. The Tocumen barracks were located not far from the airport, and by now they had been called to battle. We could hear the rising cadence of their gunfire as they moved toward us laterally. "Escort C1, advance!" someone transmitted over the radio. "Pull out! Situation under control! Over and out!" Sucre's men provided cover while Castillo, I, and several others piled into the Hyundai and drove away. It was pure luck in the bravery of those around us that kept us from being killed. The whole time, the chief of my personal staff, Captain Eliezer Gatan, was close by, trying to join up with us, listening to the radio traffic. He knew that the idea was for me to try to escape to Chiriquí or, failing that, to get to an underground bunker at El Chepo on the road to Darien. It was close to the airport that my detail of 6 men and I had our first encounter with the American paratroopers. Gatan was quoted in a newspaper interview about the invasion. There, in the main hangar, many Americans died. We shut down radio communications because they had a 100% chance of using that to pinpoint us. For the Americans, it was a technological war. We fought, but their attack was brutal. It was an unequal war in which we paid a high price in human lives. We drove to a group of houses not far from the airport, but we couldn't get too far. Our own Dignity battalions had blocked the streets with cinder blocks and building material and cars and logs, just as they were supposed to do. It took us more than an hour trying to pick our way to safety. The quiet, deserted city of an hour or so earlier had become a battle zone of debris and staccato explosions and little fires all around. Our radios no longer answered. We had no telephones. The Americans had cut the lines. Headquarters was several miles away, and by now, perhaps 1 or 2 a.m., it had already come under bomb attack. This residential area, not far from the airport, was home to many PDF enlisted men and officers, including our driver. We used the telephone at his house to make some phone calls. We called my office at Fort Amador, and a nervous enlisted man said that nothing had happened yet. No one answered the phones at command headquarters. The crack Machos del Monte Battalion, a highly trained special operations group, had moved from Rio Hato down to headquarters after October 3rd, when Major Moises Giroldi, spurred on with help from the Americans, mounted a coup attempt against me. They remained on special duty in Panama City during the invasion and ended up defending the command headquarters against the invasion. They fought fiercely and valiantly, managing to shoot down 2 helicopters, although the Americans never admitted as much. One of the helicopters crashed into a building and started a fire. The Americans then blamed the Dignity battalions for burning down Chorrillo. That was a lie. They knew what had really happened. They launched a bloody invasion in close proximity to civilians, and when they killed people, they hurled the blame, as they always did, at Panama and specifically at me. We went back to the car, drove through the chaos, trying to get to the San Miguelito military barracks, which was close to the airport highway. It was there that I was to try to meet up with the general staff. We moved through well-to-do sections of the city, deeming it unlikely that they would be subject to attack. We zigzagged around the outskirts of Panama City, passing the statue of Teddy Roosevelt. There, we cut off the main highway once again and sought refuge in San Miguelito at the house of Barbina Perinan, the member of the Legislative Assembly representing the working-class neighborhood. It was a rough trip. On the way, we saw Colonel Moises Correa and several other men standing near a yellow van not far away. I told one of my men to go talk to him. He returned soon after, saying Correa had taken off his gun and ammo clip when he saw his colleague approaching, in an apparent sign that he did not want to be a combatant. What we saw when we got to San Miguelito was a full-blown invasion. Tracers lighting the pre-dawn sky, the sound of light weapons fire, aircraft, helicopters, and explosions. My view of events was limited to what I could see from the windows of the Perinian home. Since the invasion, I have had to rely on others, one-time friends bought off by the Americans and lawyers, judges and jurors who didn't speak my language or understand the political context of what was happening to me. My life under American imprisonment has been filled with treachery and a series of events that make a mockery of what Americans call their system of fair play. I have been denied the privilege of telling my own story, blocked from providing my version of events, reviled by people who have bought the American establishment story, ridiculed, slandered, and maligned by the potency of that establishment's ability to propagandize. I now speak out, not in defense, because it is not my intention to take the weak position and acknowledge my attacker's victory. I expect to win, in the sense that I expect the vindication of history, not because I am belligerent, not because I am what I am expected to be. That ridiculous image of a man waving a machete, as if I would declare war on the United States. These are all images used by George Bush to soften the public for the carnage that took place on December 20th, 1989, to create the image of an insane fighter, just another mad dictator who dared to challenge the supremacy of the United States. I have not yet experienced the fabled American fair play that these people are raised on, that many of us Panamanians heard about while we were growing up. A fair trial, a fair hearing, human rights. I heard about fair play and the American way of life all the time in the jail where I am imprisoned, a prisoner of war. Not a self-declared prisoner of war, but a prisoner of war under the independent determination of the International Red Cross, which is the sole arbiter of the Geneva Convention. The fact is that the United States waged war on an innocent country and killed thousands of Panamanians for no good reason at all. And I sit here proudly in my uniform, the last survivor of the Panamanian Defense Forces, a captive of that war, waiting to tell my story. The crimes of the United States were well described by Mexican Catholic Bishop Mendez Arce, quoted by the Prensa Latina news agency on December 22, 1989. The United States approved the unjust invasion and the consequent destruction, mistreatment, and massacre of the Panamanian people. For us, it seems to be serious proof that the systematic lies are capable of corrupting the American public. What a detestable and shameful panorama it is to see that a government that considers itself to be the champion of democracy and justice can ignore international order and assume the roles of police, judge, jury, and executioner for everyone else. I'm still waiting for that fair hearing and fair trial. I haven't seen it yet. Perhaps my words, telling my story, will give you the ability to judge me fairly, without any filter from politicians or judges. I'll let you be the judge, because I don't need to sell my position. These are facts that are easy to see. It's important to say that I don't consider my words to be a defense. My ability to defend myself ended when the last gun was taken from my hands at the Vatican Embassy in Panama City, and I was imprisoned and taken to the United States. Instead, this is a recitation of the wrongs committed in the name of the United States. I will tell you my view of what happened and how it happened. I will tell you about myself, and after it is all done, you can call me names. You can agree with me or not, or you can judge me by the size and treachery of my enemies. Perhaps you will be persuaded that the United States has no innocence in the story, that the enemy of the story is George Bush himself, who, reasserting American colonialism in Panama and all around the world before him, invaded a country to satisfy his political agenda, killed its people, and seized its leader, who dared to defy his will. Why me? Why, after being the man the United States could count on, did I become the enemy? Because I said no. No to allowing the United States to run a school for dictators any longer in Panamanian territory. No to the request that Panama be used as a staging base for the Salvadoran death squads in the Nicaraguan Contras. Lots of no's. Combined with my defiance was lingering colonialism in the United States from conservatives like Reagan and Bush, who could not bear giving away the Panama Canal, especially to a leader who spurned their authority. So they conspired against the man they couldn't control. They made him into a madman, and what's more, a man who dared to consort with communists. Then, when they found something even worse to call him, they used that too. They called him a drug dealer, selling drugs in North America to destroy the United States. 3 times, however, they tried to force me into an agreement in which I would get every possible personal assurance, money, protection, and safe passage, as long as I would agree to exile and to leave the road clear for their control. I refused. How do you deal with such a man who dares defy you? You destroy him. Finally, factor in that you are a gutless man of weak character, a hypocrite, a liar, George Bush. You not only attack the fiend himself and his country, but also pretend that Panama is the enemy, and you kill anybody you want. No problem with the news media. You tell them that everybody you killed was the enemy, not unarmed, defenseless men, women, and children. And you pretend that the Panamanians who did fight had no right to defend their country. You control the rules of the game. You are the establishment.